Thousands of ships make millions of journeys across the world's oceans. But some never arrive at their destination. Some sink because of the actions of captain or crew. Others because of a defect in their design. The Philippines, a nation of islands. Here, 72 million people hop on ferries as routinely as Americans hop in cars. Overcrowded ships are a way of life. So no one thought twice when thousands of travelers crammed aboard a ferry like this one called the Doña Paz in December 1987. Their journey would end in the worst disaster in the history of passenger ships. Most on board were off to spend Christmas with their families. All was uneventful until 10 o'clock that night, and then they heard a loud bang.
We stood up and looked around. We saw something on fire at the front of the ship.
Doon sa bandang proa ng barko.
We ran to one side to see what it was. We saw a tanker next to the Doña Paz.
Nakatabi na sa Doña Paz. Nag-aapoy na yung dagat.
The sea was on fire, and the tanker exploded. The fire became bigger and bigger.
The Doña Paz had been hit by a coastal tanker loaded with nearly 9,000 barrels of flammable oil, and both ships were ablaze. The Doña Paz sank in minutes. Only those who immediately jumped overboard stood a chance, but it was slim. The oil had ignited. Now, the sea itself was on fire. Only 24 survivors were found, most of them with horrible burns. Eight hours had passed before the Coast Guard finally responded to the distress call. By that time, there was little wreckage and no one to be rescued. 132 bodies were recovered from the sea so badly burned that few could be identified. How many people died? Official figures put the number of passengers at no more than 1,800, but thousands of angry relatives besieged the offices of the shipping company, saying many more were missing. The final death toll was estimated at over 5,000. 1,000 of them were children. The official inquiry blamed the tanker for the collision, but the tragedy highlighted an inherent weakness in some ferries, their tendency to suddenly capsize. 14,000 people have died in ferry accidents since 1980. Roll-on, roll-off car ferries have revolutionized shipping. A large open deck with doors at both the bow and the stern allows cars and trucks to roll up at one port and roll off at another, all within minutes of docking. To make them easier to load, ro-ro ferries do not have watertight barriers or bulkheads on the car decks. Over 20 million passengers a year travel on such ferries from England across the English Channel to the continent of Europe. On the evening of March 6, 1987, a ferry called the Herald of Free Enterprise left the Belgian port of Zeebrugge on its return journey to England. It was a fine night and promised to be a routine crossing. Ken Hollingsby, a steward in the duty-free shop, was serving a long line of customers.
I stood up for a break. A friend of mine took over, and as he sat down and I stood up, the ship lurched. A bottle of brandy came out of the shelf and broke on my chest, or on my head, but all over my shirt. First thoughts were, have I got a clean shirt? And I have. So I turned to go and get a clean shirt, and as I turned, so it lurched again, more bottles started coming out, and so I started shielding passengers from the bottles that were flying around. But as I turned to shield them against the bottles, I could see all the windows disappearing on the opposite side of the lounge, and these enormous waterfalls coming in. And people going out of the windows holding onto each other's feet, and I thought, it's incredible, how are they doing that?
There was a big crash as though somebody had had a lot of plates all smashing and everybody cheering, and those cheers stayed in that loud area of cheering and went onwards into screams. I was observing a cold drinks cabinet that was sliding. It was getting faster, until eventually it left the deck and flew through the air and smashed against the people right alongside me. But while I was doing this, one of the portholes exploded inwards. Water started pouring in.
The ferry was on its side in 60 feet of water, a mile outside the Belgian harbor. Of the 600 passengers and crew, many were killed when the ship turned over. Surviving crew members launched a desperate struggle to rescue those who were still trapped inside. One of the first to clamber up the slippery hull was Ken Hollingsby. He helped drop rope ladders down into the darkness of the ship.
People did start using them. Some refusing to let go of their duty-frees and their handbags and all the rest of it, but one I can understand with a dead child. I mean, she didn't want to let go of him, but she did eventually, only if I promised to follow her up carrying the baby.
Rescue teams eventually arrived on the scene.
We zijn nu bij dat schip. Het ligt dus met de steven aan de wal. Buiten de noordelijke dam. Ten oosten van de geur. En het schip ligt dus over bakboord met zijn schoorstenen in het water.
Inside the darkened ship, all was chaos. Smashed furniture and bodies, the water steadily rising. The walls had become the ceilings. Harry Bispham found himself trapped under a glass partition with water up to his neck.
There was no way we could break the glass. Very, very quickly, you have to work out, take the last breath that you can. How long that lasts, I don't know, but as soon as that's gone, then you've got to come to terms with the inevitable. You're going to drown, you're going to die.
Two hours had elapsed since the ship turned over. Passengers were now dying not by drowning, but from hypothermia as they waited to be rescued.
I didn't think anyone was going to die on it. I thought everyone, there were so many people coming up them ladders that I thought we're going to get them all off. But then the first few dead ones started coming out, which I didn't like very much. I did make a vain attempt at reviving one woman, but I was pulled off and told it was too late. There was men we pulled out on ropes, and once they passed an arm, the arm came straight out the sleeve, and it was obviously been severed, and he was in so cold or whatever, he never felt it.